Welcome. I'm Lindsay McKinnon, and this is Eyes to See, where we heal from hurts, traumas, and toxic relationships. This is part 2 of our series on boundaries, where we will learn exactly what is holding us back from utilizing this superpower. Boundaries are a superpower, and we're going to challenge our perception of boundaries, of what they mean, how to set them, what they are, all of that. So please remember to click subscribe right now so that you can get notified of the other videos like this and more. I'm also going to be doing a 12-part series on anxiety that's going to be coming out simultaneously. So if boundaries are so great, and if they're even biblical like I talked about in video 1, then why don't we all have them in place already? Why do most people, especially women of faith, struggle so hard to set boundaries? I struggled so hard to set boundaries. It's still sometimes a struggle. It depends on the circumstance, but I've gotten a lot better. But there's so many facets to what we've been taught about them and not taught about them and what our beliefs are. So understanding this is really important because when we see the why, we can address those root issues so that you can start setting healthy boundaries for yourself. So mainly, we're never taught boundaries. Think about that. A lot of us grew up without learning a healthy boundaries. We didn't see that in any family setting. Perhaps in your family, no was not an option. Like if parents or elders demanded something, you had to comply, period. You were a kid. Or maybe you saw one of your parents always give in or always overextend themselves. So that became your model. That happens a lot with women. A lot of times we see our moms or our grandmas or our aunts or whoever was raising you and whoever your feminine example was, and she's just doing it all. And we watch her just bend over backwards. We watch her break. We watch her, serve everyone else, put herself on the back burner, never be there for herself, never take time for herself, or feeling guilty if she did. And that's what was taught to us instead of healthy boundaries being taught to us. So many Christian communities also emphasize serving others, obviously, which is beautiful and important. But it seldom explicitly also teaches how to balance that with personal limits. So we internalize the idea that saying yes is good and saying no is bad. So that's why saying no feels mean, then we feel bad afterwards. We, have false guilt, which we're going to talk about, and condemnation, not conviction, two very different things. The boundaries are a skill, and if no one taught you, then it's no wonder that you struggle. Of course you struggle. Like if you weren't taught how to write cursive, you're not going to know how to write cursive. So the good news about that, though, is that skills can be learned, even now as an adult. So give yourself grace if you haven't been good at boundaries. You're here and you're learning now. Another reason that we have such trouble setting boundaries is just a misunderstanding of Scripture and of faith. I have a whole video I'm going to do in this series on untwisting Scripture that we use or that are used against us when it comes to boundary setting. So as Christian women, we might think of verses like deny yourself or lay down your life for others mean that we shouldn't have boundaries. But that's not true. We have to clarify the fact that even Jesus said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Yes, in Luke he said that. But self-denial in terms of surrendering sinful desires and putting God first is what he's talking about there. Not self-denial in the term of self-neglect. That's not the same thing. Self-denial, denying of self, carrying your cross is not the same as self-neglect. God never calls us to neglect our body, our mind, or our soul that he gave us. In fact, he actually says that our body's a temple of the Holy Spirit. And who wants a temple that's trashed and trampled and overrun? It needs respect and it needs care. So healthy boundaries ensure that when we sacrifice, it's free. It's given by choice. It's a spirit-led choice, not from coercion or abuse. And even that coercion can be just mental coercion. Maybe nobody's saying it to you, but they have before, or you feel like nobody's going to step up, and so you're doing it out of obligation. We also have issues setting boundaries because of fear of rejection. That's a big one. Like if I set a boundary, then the other person might get upset with me. They're going to leave. They're going to love me less. It's going to cause a divide between our relationship, and that fear can be really paralyzing. Or maybe you avoid saying no because you just can't bear the thought of someone being disappointed or angry with you. And that's normal because psychologically we are wired to seek acceptance and avoid rejection. It's a basic human need to belong. But the enemy exploits that fear to keep us trapped in people-pleasing, seeking external validation, which is not what God says that we should be doing, And we might think, like, if I say that I can't help this time, then maybe they won't want to be my friend anymore. Or if I tell my relatives that their comments hurt me, they are just going to stop talking to me altogether and I'll be alone. And for Christian women, that can be tied to our identity as the nice one, the good girl, the helpful one. You know, we think our value comes from always being agreeable to a certain degree. But let me tell you something. Your value comes from being a daughter of God, not from how much you do for others. Real friends and family who truly love you, they might be momentarily confused or even a little upset when you change a pattern or start to set a boundary, but they won't abandon you just because you set a healthy boundary. They most likely will respect you more, encourage you in it, give them a chance. You know, maybe you haven't even tried or you haven't tried in the right ways, and I'm going to help teach you those. And it can change that relationship and you can go deeper. Drawing boundaries gives people a chance to connect deeper with us because it's us saying, this is who I truly am, this is what I truly need, meet me there. And so if someone does leave you or gives you the cold shoulder forever because you simply started being honest about your limits and your needs, it's a painful revelation, but perhaps it shows that that relationship was actually conditional or unhealthy to begin with, and they were using you in a way. We might have to come to that revelation in some of our relationships when we start to set boundaries. People who have a problem with your boundaries are often the ones who benefited from you not having them. Think about that. So of course, the ones who get angriest when you start saying no are usually the ones who are taking advantage of your yeses. Healthy, loving people might be a little surprised, yes, but they will ultimately respect your boundary. Unhealthy people will resist and lash out. So yes, you risk some rejection or some pushback. I'm going to have a video on how to handle all that though. But that actually helps you discern who truly cares for you versus who is using you. That's also why boundaries are a superpower. Not only in getting to know yourself better and have deeper connections, but they're a discernment tool. When you start to set a boundary and you see how someone reacts, it tells you a lot about that person. And it might reveal some things that are going to be hard to accept, but that need to be accepted. We also have trouble setting boundaries because of guilt. Oh, guilt. Yep. That horrible, heavy feeling of, I'm doing something wrong. I'm doing something wrong when you try to set a boundary. So many of us have an inner critic, or even maybe an external voice like from your past that rings in your head that says things like, well, how could you? That's not nice. Think about how they feel. You should be more giving. And that normally happens, especially if the person that's pushing your boundaries is someone that you care about, you know, and so you feel guilty for not meeting their expectations. And that's where some people pleasing comes in, and some caretaking comes in, and some codependency comes in. But as Christian women, it seems like we get extra guilty. We have extra guilt because we worry we're also not being a good Christian or not being a good Christian wife by saying no or by confronting someone's behavior. We've got to challenge that. We have to challenge that guilt with truth, because there is such a thing as real guilt and false guilt. And there's real guilt when we sin or do wrong, which leads to repentance. But there is false guilt, which is feeling guilty for something that is not actually wrong. So setting a boundary to protect your health, your family, your sanity is not a sin. It's not wrong. So when you start to set a boundary and someone acts or makes you feel guilty about it, ask yourself, ask God, is this a sin that I'm asking for? And if not, it's a good boundary, and that's false guilt. Feeling guilty, because that feeling comes because of our programming, feeling guilty does not automatically mean you're doing something wrong. It might just mean that you're doing something different, and you have to retrain your brain to say, no, I weighed this against the Bible. I weighed this against the Spirit. I asked God, this isn't wrong. I'm feeling like I'm wrong because I don't want someone to dislike me or have discord with me, but really, that's a them problem, because this was a healthy, normal, good request that I asked for. We have to get to that place in our minds. Often guilt is the glue that keeps us stuck in unhealthy patterns. Guilt about saying no is one of the strongest forces that keep most people in toxic relationships. It really is. Manipulative people know that you feel guilty whenever you try to set a boundary. They know that you feel guilty easily, and they will use it. It's hard to believe sometimes because we're not those people that would use it. So you're like, that just can't be true. That's evil. That's mean. That's horrible. I wouldn't do that to someone. But you've got to remember, not everybody is like you. Just because you wouldn't doesn't mean that they don't. So they might say something like, how can you do this to me after all that I've done for you? If you really were a good daughter, you'd do this. And they plant guilt. They plant it like they're baiting a hook, and we bite because we have tender hearts. We have empathy. We care. But you've got to discern something. There's a difference between guilt and conviction. Remember that. Conviction is from the Holy Spirit. It's specific. It's about genuine sin, and it leads to positive changes. Okay? False guilt is often vague or based on others' expectations, and it leads to slavery. In Galatians 5:1, it says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Constant guilt in relationships can become a yoke of slavery. This is when we talk about escaping abusive relationships. It's because you're being oppressed. Oppression, slavery. God hates oppression. He parted the Red Sea because he hated oppression so much. So think about that. He did not die for you to live in slavery under any human. He died to set you free from sin and free from man-made bondage. Guilt that someone else is putting on you is them trying to put bondage on you. Okay? So when guilt hits, you have to ask, have I actually done something wrong according to God? That's the important part. If not, pray to release that guilt. Replace the false belief. Pray for God to help you with that. If I'm like the thought of I'm bad if I don't do what they want, you have to combat that with the truth and say to yourself, I'm still loving and faithful even when I say no to something that isn't right for me. God still loves me. So we'll talk more on handling guilt trips later. But another reason that we have such issues setting boundaries is the people pleasing, which I have a whole video on that. People pleasing and cultural conditioning are the reasons that we have trouble setting boundaries a lot of the time. Many of us, including myself, have a bit of a people pleaser inside. We want others to be happy. We avoid saying or doing things that might upset someone else. Some of that can be kindness, sure, but when it goes too far, we sacrifice our own needs and even our own truths. And culture often reinforces it by saying something like, well, be a good girl, don't rock the boat. And women in particular are often socialized to be accommodating and more nurturing and not as assertive. So perhaps you heard messages like, nice girls don't disagree, or you saw that, when you complied with that, you were praised. But when you asserted yourself, you were labeled bossy or difficult. None of us want to be bossy. We hated being called bossy as little girls. I was just a strong personality person, and I had been called bossy in my life. And I hate that because I'm like, I'm not being bossy just because I have some standards. And if it's about me and I'm not trying to control you, that's not bossy. So you have to combat those lies that people try to put on us. Society tries to put on us. So if that was you and you experienced any of that, you learned to suppress your voice. And in church, the ideal of this selfless woman who never says no, the tireless volunteer, the agreeable wife, all of those ideals, they can be misapplied. They're great ideals, but they can be misapplied. And they can pressure us to ignore our God-given limits. God gives us limits. Yes, he does. So we have to bust that myth. And I want to use Proverbs 31 woman as an example. She had servants. She delegated tasks. She wasn't doing everything alone with no limits. In Proverbs 31:15, it says that she managed her household wisely. Wise management includes saying no to some things so you can say yes to the right things. So even that woman that we all aspire to be like in the Bible, she delegated. She didn't take it all on herself. She was wise enough to see the difference and wise enough to know that she couldn't do it all and still be that Proverbs 31 woman. It would have taken from who she was. So people-pleasing is often rooted in seeking that external validation. And when you focus on pleasing God first, and God sometimes does want you to say no, by the way, you ironically end up being healthier in your human relationships too. So we have to remember that. Always seeking God first, getting in the Word, and being honest with Him when you have these struggles. He knows. He made you. And He's seen your whole life. He's watched your decisions. He's watched the people that have been around you. He knows who has affected you and in what ways. And He still loves you, and He still wants you to not be under the burden of man-made bondage. Another reason that we don't set boundaries a lot of the time is just massive fear of conflict or fear of anger. It's a big one, and it's really a big one if you're in a narcissistic or an abusive relationship, because that's going to happen. But they do that anyway, to be honest. They're going to be angry with you if you don't set a boundary because they're going to choose something to nitpick about and attack you over. They're going to be angry with you when you do set a boundary because they're going to lose control. But at which one of those do you walk away with a little bit more of yourself? Setting the boundary anyway. So we fear confrontation a lot of the times in all kinds of relationships, not just abusive ones. And a boundary often involves telling someone something that they might not want to hear, like no, or stop, or this isn't okay. And many of us dread that. I used to dread that. I mean, I would get shaky. I would get all red and break out in hives all but. It was just, I couldn't stand, I have to have that conversation with someone and I'm so afraid of having it. What if they blow up at me? What if it starts a big fight? And, perhaps you grew up in a house where conflict meant yelling or abuse. And so now any sign of discord really triggers a panic in you. That's what I was experiencing, a preemptive panic for something that hadn't even happened yet, but just because of what I witnessed growing up. And it feels safer then to just keep quiet or go along, stuff it down, I can handle it, I'll just take it. Or maybe you've had a friend who even when they were gently confronted, they unleashed anger on you or gave you the silent treatment for weeks and broke your heart in a friendship. And those kinds of traumas teach you, avoid conflict at all costs or you'll get hurt, danger, danger. But that's not true. That's a lie from the enemy because he wants to keep us stuck in people pleasing. He wants to keep us stuck in seeking external validation. So here is the truth. Some people do react badly when you set boundaries. Yes, especially if they're not used to you having any. Of course. They might get angry, they might yell, they might cry, they might try to argue. Conflict is uncomfortable, no doubt. But avoiding necessary conflict leads to a worse outcome. Internal conflict. You end up angry at yourself. You end up full of stress and resentment. And then you can't show up even in the times that you want to because there's something else in the back of your mind. Or there's a wall between you and this person that maybe wouldn't be there if you would have just had the conversation. So it's kind of like if I show up for a job and I was agreed to this certain pay and agreed to this certain work, but then the work starts to change and the pay didn't change with it. If I don't go to my boss and say, hey, this changed and I think that I should be paid and compensated for these changes, and then I don't say anything to them and I just build up and I build up and I build up and I get mad and eventually I just quit that job and leave, they had no idea that I was offended, that I needed a change. They aren't in my head. They don't know what I need. So we have to advocate for the things that could otherwise breed resentment. Resentment's a tool of the devil. He wants that inside of us because it blows up opportunities, it blows up relationships, it messes with our internal minds and our internal love for ourselves because of that, because we don't want to feel angry with someone, but yet we feel this anger and we don't know what to do with it or how to get rid of it now. But usually if we go back to the beginning, if a conversation had been had and we hadn't avoided that conflict, none of this would have built up. So I just want to encourage you that conflict can be healthy. And in fact, it's often the path to greater understanding in a relationship, all kinds of relationships, romantic, work relationships, family relationships, friendships, all of them. So the Bible offers guidance in this. In Matthew, it says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. So, hey, go have a conversation. It's essentially saying, go set a boundary. Go have a boundary setting conversation. That takes courage. But Jesus wouldn't have told us to do it if it wasn't something necessary and if it wasn't something that's ultimately beneficial. So also, I just want to remind you that not all conflict is explosive. That is hard to remember. Sometimes we have to weigh when we are expecting someone to react negatively to our boundary or our confrontation. Did they ever actually give us evidence of that? Or are we taking past experiences and putting them on that person in an expected way? So not all conflict is explosive. What you experienced when you were younger or in that past or in that abusive relationship doesn't necessarily mean that that's always how it's going to be with someone. Give that other person a chance and give them a chance to show you their true colors. Give them a chance to step up. And when you handle it with prayer and calmness and respect, a boundary conversation can be really gentle. It really can. And I'm going to have a whole video where we talk about how to have those conversations. But we often imagine the worst case scenario, and that never actually even fully materializes most of the time. So if that other person does explode, just remember that's about them, not about you. If you came to them calm and centered and, from a genuine place, and then they still explode on you, that's a them problem, not a you problem. Like in the Bible, it says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. So we can't guarantee the other person's response, but we can control our side, speaking truth in love. And some will still react poorly, especially at first, but then you'll really know who you're dealing with. Like I said, it really helps with discernment. And then another reason that we don't set boundaries a lot of the time is manipulation and gaslighting. There's going to be a whole video on that. But some of us struggle to set boundaries because we've been on the receiving end of manipulation tactics, and boundaries were used to move us around and handle us. And so perhaps the moment that you try, the other person is going to twist the situation to make you feel like the bad guy. That's called gaslighting. That's when someone invalidates your reality and makes you question your memory or your sanity. And they say things like, that never happened. You're overreacting. You're so sensitive. You're so selfish. You're so ungrateful just because you brought up an issue. That's gaslighting. And we'll have a video on that. But just know what that is when you face it, and know that that's dealing with someone that is got their gate closed. Remember I talked about the gate earlier, and you're opening your gate for them probably a little too often, if at all. Maybe you shouldn't be. So if you've been gaslighted, you might doubt yourself. You might think, well, maybe they're right. Maybe I am overly sensitive. Maybe this is me making a mountain out of a molehill. Maybe I'm wrong to object. Maybe this isn't a big deal and I shouldn't say anything about it. No. Listen to my voice. If that's you, if you're in that type of relationship, hear me out. And please remember this. You are not crazy, and you are not wrong, selfish, unloving, or ugly for wanting respect. Toxic individuals, like narcissists, are experts at flipping the script. You confront their bad behavior, and then suddenly you find yourself defending your tone, how you brought it up, what was said 10 years ago even. Like, it just goes down this crazy rabbit trail, and they derail the entire conversation, so the boundary actually never gets addressed, and then it's flipped around on you, and you're in defense mode, defending who you are even just at your base of character. And then you're like, whoa, that's not what this was supposed to look like. That's not what I even came here to talk about. But this is how it ended up. And now this is what I have to focus on. And that is all a strategy. That's not an accident, y'all. It's a strategy. It's a strategy to keep you under control, because what they want is control. Another manipulation that a lot of times will be used is guilt tripping. This happens a lot with, parental situations, adult parents, like the mom that wants you to come for Christmas, and it really wouldn't be beneficial for you to put the kids in the car and travel all that way just for a day, and all these different things. And we'll touch on that. But, they say things like, and anybody can say this, but after all I've done for you, or if you don't do this, then you clearly don't care about me. That goes straight for your heart, especially for someone that they know is a caring person. That's them, manipulating you. That's a guilt trip. Or they might use fear, like threats of leaving you, threats of cutting off support, or even harming themselves if you don't comply with what they're saying they want. That's not a boundary, by the way. That's guilt tripping. So when faced with such tactics, of course you struggle to stick to a boundary. It feels like stepping into a minefield, because you are, technically. And we're going to go deep on handling those later in other videos in the series. But for now, just recognize if you fear conflict because the other person fights dirty, like manipulates you, gaslights you, guilt trips you, your hesitation's totally understandable. And, over the years, you've learned that setting a boundary with this person is going to be really, really hard. But remember this, hard does not mean impossible. You may need extra support. You may need to get with a counselor or a friend or a pastor who really gets boundaries and understands what you're going through to back you up. So that, like I said, so you have that other voice in your head, not just them and not just, the voice that they programmed in you that you think is yours. And in some cases, if the person's truly abusive and unsafe, then you might need to set boundaries from a distance, like not a face-to-face talk, like implementing low or no contact for a time with someone. And then also, I want to mention that we struggle setting boundaries because of low self-worth, which also stems from being in an abusive relationship or having a traumatic or abusive childhood. So, I need to mention this because sometimes we don't set boundaries because deep, deep down, we actually don't feel like we deserve to. That's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking for God, because He made you, and He says that you are deserving of that. And we might think, who am I to demand respect or rest? I'm nothing special. That's the voice of an abuser. That's the voice of the enemy. That is not your voice. That's not from God. So if you struggle with self-esteem, you might unconsciously accept poor treatment because you think that that's the best you can get, or that you have to earn love by enduring things. No, you do not have to prove your worth by overextending yourself. You have inherent dignity, and it's okay and even necessary to protect that dignity with boundaries. Remember, protecting the garden that you're given. In fact, not doing so can allow others to continue in sin. They're sinning against you because they're disrespecting you and they're abusing you, and that doesn't help them either. It's enabling in a lot of ways. And so sometimes the most loving thing that you can do for both you and the other person is to set that boundary. It teaches them how to treat others properly, and it guards your God-given value. So to put it simply, we struggle to set boundaries because it's uncomfortable. It pushes against our fears and old habits. But growth is uncomfortable at first, always. Just think about it like going to the gym and exercising a muscle. You know, if it's not been used, it's sore initially, but then it strengthens. So every time you set a small boundary, you're building a muscle. Over time, it gets easier and it becomes more natural. And I want to mention too that the 5-second rule is a good tool for this. So that's the idea of counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then taking action before your brain talks you out of it. So like when you know that you need to assert a boundary and you feel that hesitation, and you know, maybe you are telling yourself, well, maybe I'll wait till they're in this mood, or I'll wait until this is happening, or I'll wait until next week, or I'll wait until then. No. Try to silently count down and then speak. Just 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, I need to talk to you about something. And just open that conversation up. Just get the words out. Action kills anxiety. So, you know, you might have to live with the discomfort of knowing that someone's not going to like your boundary. It's true. It's uncomfortable at first, but it's temporary discomfort, all for long-term health. You know, a saying is that when we care about what other people think about you, you will always be their prisoner. And that's so true. And we do care about people, but we cannot be imprisoned by their opinions or fear of their opinions or judgment. We seek to love them, but love does not equal compliance to all demands. And I want to say this, please remember this. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance. And of course, remember, a huge important part of all of this is to pray for the courage. Take this to God. The early church in Acts, they prayed for boldness to speak truth. You can pray for boldness to speak your truth of your boundaries in love. Lord, grant me the courage to set this boundary, and I trust you with the outcome. Remember, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and a sound mind. Power and love, so the power to speak up, and love in the way that we do it. A sound mind in the fact that a clear mind to know it's the right thing to do. Combating that false guilt with actually what true guilt is. And I want you to take a deep breath right now, because that was a lot. It was pretty heavy. If you listen to all this and you're feeling it, it might have triggered some things in you. So just take a deep breath. I know that you might be thinking of specific people or specific situations in your life. It can stir up a lot of anxiety and memories. But just remember that God is with you in this. You're not going to tackle it alone. And as we keep going in these next videos, just keep inviting the Holy Spirit to work on your heart, to replace lies with truth, and to give you courage where there's fear. Dear Lord, please replace my lies with your truth, and please replace any courage I have or any fear I have with your courage. The courage that already lives inside of you, by the way, that God already gave you. Thank you for watching this, and whatever you're going through, know that it doesn't last forever, and you can actually make the choice to change your life today. It can start in this very moment. You can be the true you, and the true you that God, created, and the person that you can truly love. A lot of times when we have such a lack of self-love, it's because we don't know ourselves, and a lot of times we don't know ourselves because we've allowed other people to push and pull and tell us who we are, and a lot of times that came through people-pleasing and lack of setting boundaries. When we set a boundary, it tells us who we are, what's truly important to us. So I hope that you think on that. I hope that you pray on that. And I love you. Have a good day.